seriously, why the fuck do they have to do this? It's absolutely insane. Every single household that falls under the European Union, some 27 countries, will be receiving information and details in the post to their home address on how to build survival kits and how to prepare for all-out war. I mean, what fucking good is a 3-day survival kit going to do in case of an all-out war or a natural disaster? The EU are also claiming that they are doing this to ensure panic does not set in if disaster strikes. Oh yes, I'm not going to panic because I've got a fucking leaflet in the post, innit? I mean, they must think and expect something serious is going to happen if every single household across 27 nations is going to be receiving information on how to store batteries and water and whatever else. Oh look, there goes a nuclear missile that's going to land in the field behind me, but I'm not going to panic because I've got Duracell batteries, some water and tinned cat food.
Okay, so you sent us a really interesting collection of articles this time, and, well, frankly, they paint a pretty intense picture. You know, Europe seemingly gearing up for a major conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely something that's been making headlines, and it's worth digging into to see what's really going on.
Exactly. So let's do a deep dive into these sources and try to make sense of what this reported shift is all about and why it should matter to all of us listening right now.
Absolutely. Sounds good. So your sources this week, it's quite a range, actually. Everything from the Fiji Times to The Economist and several others in between. And they all seem to converge on one central theme. Europe is making some pretty significant moves in preparation for a potential World War III scenario.
Wow, World War III, that's not something you hear every day.
No, it's definitely not. And it's the kind of phrase that grabs your attention. And at the heart of this concern, as these articles really underscore, is the possibility of future Russian aggression.
Okay, so Russian aggression, that's a pretty big statement. So let's break that down. What exactly is this perceived threat that these articles are highlighting?
Well, the main worry, and you see this reflected across all these different publications, is the fear that Europe is gearing up for World War III because of a very real concern about Russia's intentions.
Okay, so you're saying that there's a real palpable sense of fear about what Russia might do.
Yes, absolutely. Several sources specifically talk about a potential Russian invasion with the goal of pushing NATO forces out of Eastern Europe.
Pushing NATO out of Eastern Europe, that's a major geopolitical shift.
Yeah, and some articles even go so far as to say that Russia's ultimate goal is to reestablish a kind of Russian empire.
A Russian empire? Wow, that sounds like something out of a history book.
Yeah, it does have a bit of a historical ring to it, but it's important to remember that history often has a way of repeating itself. And these articles are suggesting that this is a very real possibility.
So this isn't just some abstract fear. This is something that people are taking very seriously.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just journalists or analysts who are sounding the alarm. The EU Commission itself is reportedly saying that the European Union needs to be prepared for the possibility of a large-scale war with Moscow.
Wow, the EU Commission, that's a pretty authoritative voice.
Right, and that statement carries a lot of weight. It really underscores the seriousness of this situation.
So we've got this fear of a potential Russian invasion, this talk of a reestablished Russian empire, and now the EU Commission's saying that they need to prepare for a major war. This is all pretty heavy stuff.
It is, and it's not just talk either. We're seeing concrete actions being taken on the ground.
Right, so what kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, for starters, many European countries are significantly increasing their defense budgets.
Okay, so they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly, and they're not just throwing money at the problem. They're also placing a renewed emphasis on strengthening their military capabilities.
So we're talking about new weapons systems, training exercises, that kind of thing?
Yes, exactly.
Oh.
And there's another aspect to this that's worth mentioning.
What's that?
Some of your sources actually talk about growing calls within the UK to consider something pretty drastic.
Oh, really? What's that?
Conscription.
Conscription. Wow, that's a big step. Bringing back the draft, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that's already being considered or even implemented in some other European countries.
So they're really taking this threat seriously enough to consider mandatory military service. That's a pretty clear indication of the level of concern.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's not just about building up armies either. There's a strong focus on preparing the civilian population as well.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. So what are they doing to prepare everyday citizens?
Well, France seems to be taking a particularly proactive approach.
What are they doing?
Several articles, specifically, the Daily Telegraph and Euronews talk about their plan to distribute a 20-page invasion survival how-to guide to every citizen.
A 20-page invasion survival guide. Wow, that's pretty wild. It really brings home the reality of the situation.
Right. It's not just about military strategy anymore. It's about preparing the entire population for a potential conflict.
So this survival guide, it's basically like a how-to manual for surviving a war.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And, for you, the listener, this shift from a purely governmental defense strategy to one where civilian resilience is also considered crucial really reflects the potential scale and impact of the conflict that they're worried about.
That's a really important point. So what kind of advice are they giving people in this guide?
Well, one thing they emphasize is the importance of citizens actively contributing to the national defense effort.
So things like volunteering for reserve units or participating in local civil defense initiatives?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they also provide very practical guidance on assembling a personal survival kit.
A survival kit. So what kind of stuff are they telling people to stock up on?
Well, the essentials that come up again and again are 6 liters of water per person, a good supply of canned food batteries for things like radios and flashlights, and a basic first aid kit.
So basically the essentials you would need to survive if things went really bad.
Yeah, exactly. And this advice actually aligns with broader warnings coming from the EU itself.
Right. I saw that in a couple of articles. The Irish Mirror and the Taipei Times mentioned that the EU is urging citizens to take stock and be prepared and to specifically stockpile food supplies.
Yeah, so it's not just France. It seems like there's a coordinated effort across Europe to encourage people to be prepared.
And, this kind of advice really highlights the potential severity of this situation. They're not just talking about a minor skirmish. They're talking about a conflict that could disrupt everyday life in a major way.
Right. And it's not just about physical survival either. There's also a psychological aspect to it.
What do you mean?
Well, imagine being told to prepare for a potential invasion. It's bound to have a psychological impact on people.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be pretty unsettling, to say the least.
And that's something that these governments are having to take into account as well.
So it's not just about tanks and missiles. It's about preparing for a conflict that could have a profound impact on society as a whole.
Exactly. And it's something that we haven't really seen in Europe since World War II.
And that's a pretty sobering thought.
It is. So to kind of bring it back to our listeners, it seems that the general consensus in Europe right now is that a large-scale conflict is no longer a distant possibility, but something that requires active and serious preparation.
Yeah. So we've talked about the perceived threat and the very real preparations that are underway. Now let's delve a little deeper into the why behind all of this. What are the fundamental reasons that are driving this concern and these rather significant readiness measures?
Well, the articles you shared are pretty clear on this. The primary driving force is fear of Vladimir Putin's intentions following the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
So there's a widespread apprehension across Europe that Putin might not stop with Ukraine.
Exactly. And this fear is fueling the rearmament programs and the preparedness initiatives that we're seeing.
It's interesting, though, because one of the articles you mentioned, I think it's from the Philadelphia Inquirer, quoted Macron as saying that not all European allies are in complete agreement on the specific plans for defending Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a really important point you raise. Even though there's a general sense of urgency and a collective move towards strengthening defenses, it's not a completely unified front.
So there are some disagreements about the best way to handle this threat.
Right. And Macron's statement highlights the fact that there are different perspectives and maybe even varying levels of commitment among European allies.
So even in the face of this perceived threat, there's not necessarily complete unity.
Exactly. And that adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation. It raises the question of how significant these disagreements might be in hindering a truly coordinated response.
Yeah, that's a good question. So taking all of this into account, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the biggest takeaway is that there's a significantly heightened level of concern within Europe about a potential large-scale conflict with Russia.
And this concern is driving a whole range of preparedness measures, from increased military spending to potential conscription to the distribution of survival guides.
Exactly. And the root cause of all of this is a deep-seated fear of Russia's long-term intentions, particularly in light of what's happening in Ukraine.
So as our listeners are processing all of this information, the preparations, the anxieties, the underlying reasons, it really begs a bigger question.
What's that?
What does all of this mean for the future of Europe and the world as a whole?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. And hopefully this deep dive into these sources has provided our listeners with a clearer understanding of the situation and the complex dynamics that are at play.
I think it has, and I hope it encourages everyone to stay informed and engaged, because these are issues that affect all of us.
I agree. And as always, we encourage our listeners to continue to share interesting sources with us so we can keep having these important conversations.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening, everyone.
And thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
See you next time.
See you then.
$450 million citizens. It's 450 million reasons to be better prepared. In the EU, we must think different because the threats are different. And we are also beefing up our Union Civil Protection Mechanism, the UCPM, our protective shield in times of emergency. It coordinates aid, mobilizes emergency teams, and delivers life-saving assistance when floods, but also wildfires and other disasters strike. We have done it in Spain, in Ireland, in Mozambique, in Mayotte, and just recently, last week, in North Macedonia, with more than 50 burn victims of a nightclub fire being taken care of in EU hospitals. So when we get the call, we go. Rescue or European safety net. This strategy reserve helped the EU respond to every type of emergency with firefighting planes, stockpiles of vital medical energy and transport equipment, and specialized assets against chemical, biological, radiological and